Hello, everyone. Back again, Uncle Coach Kevin Gallagher, with another installment of the AC Jiu-Jitsu Club interview series, blog post series, things we've been doing to talk to some cool people in the Jiu-Jitsu community and let you guys tune in a little bit and find about throwing out a few things about Jiu-Jitsu from these guys and gals. So today, in particular, we have someone that I've talked to before. I've spoken before. Someone's quite accomplished as a grappler. In the community. She is a Marcelo Garcia black belt and a 2007 Mundial's champion, and also a Nogi champion 2010 world champion. So welcome to the show, Miss Emily Kwok. Thank you so much for giving us your time.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, awesome, cool. So, are you mad at me because I called you a gal from the start? Can we get that off the table? Did I screw it up already?
No, I think it's funny. A few weeks, or what was it, 2 weeks ago, Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, and I was reading in an article, she said something like, helpful advice to live. And one of the best things that she was told to do is sometimes to be deaf to certain things. That's
right.
Just to get along. I don't.
I sincerely apologize because it's something that I try my best to work on, but one of my many things is just being is insensitive to anyone else's problems as I possibly can. It's not that I don't care about you. It's just that
not your normal.
I can't wrap my brain around things. It's hard for me sometimes.
I don't expect you to be an Asian woman. Sorry.
That's a good point. That's a very good point. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit about you, because I'm excited because we had you on briefly talking about another topic, but it wasn't really about Miss Emily, and I would love to hear your story because you're a pretty incredible person of yourself. So tell us a little about you. Tell us about how you started grappling, some of the things of your life. Let's hear the Emily story in a nutshell.
It's pretty boring, I think. I mean, it's I think maybe the most interesting thing to people might be that I come from I've been training jiu-jitsu for about 20 years, and I come from, I would say, a time or a generation when hobbyists could still succeed, and jiu-jitsu was not really what it is seen as today. So when I started, it was just sort of a recreational activity that I jumped into. It was a bit obscure, and I really enjoyed myself, and I had no aspirations, nor did I have any awareness that it would ever turn into anything or that there were world championships. I just jumped with 2 feet in because I like wrestling. And the next thing you knew, it took over my life. So I went from, competing in small local competitions to bigger ones in Japan and all over the United States. And I sort of naively jumped into it. And it I don't know, it's kind of like buying the lottery ticket at the right time. I had no idea when I started that it would turn into what it's turned into. So I managed to accomplish a few things along the way.
So in particular, what I'm interested in is exactly what you said, the time frame of which you started training, because that's something that I always am interested about, because I'm kind of on the cusp of that area. I started training about 2009. Mm-hmm. So MMA and the UFC was already, a viable brand, but the idea of the marvelous world of jiu-jitsu that we know now with competition jiu-jitsu and all these big names and the fanfare that it gets is very very different than it was at that time. And in particular, back when you started training back in the early 2000s, it's very, very difficult, very, very different from that area. So tell me in particular what it was like for you, not only being someone that came onto jiu-jitsu before jiu-jitsu was really a thing. Tell us about what it was like being a female in that period of time when, I imagine it was pretty hard for you to find other females to be involved in jiu-jitsu at that time.
Yeah, I would say that I probably started competing because I was looking for other females, comparative references of where, comparative relative reference to where my own level was. Because if I trained jiu-jitsu most of the time, it was training with dudes. There were a handful of women, sprinkled in and out, but few that trained as hard as I did at the time. We certainly weren't the same size. So all the variables were varied, and there really weren't a lot of, as a woman, you couldn't go in and say that you wanted to work with a particular kind of person. If you were a female 20 years ago, you showed up because you wanted to fight and you wanted to learn how to fight, and it didn't matter who they put in front of you because you didn't have a choice. And
Now, when you say wanted to fight, do you mean wanted to fight for self-defense purposes, or do you mean wanting to fight for a potential MMA bid?
maybe somewhere in between. So I think women for self-defense has always been a thing because everyone thinks that they should learn how to defend themselves, which I agree. It's a good life skill to have. Women's MMA wasn't really so much of a thing. I mean, at the time when I started, I was in Vancouver, where I'm from, in Canada, and there were MMA fights that were happening illegally on Indian reservations. It wasn't really something that was happening out in the open. One of my coaches at the time, Dennis Kang, who went on to fight in Pride and UFC, he would sometimes fight overseas, and there were sometimes some promotions that were happening around strange places in Canada, but it wasn't nearly as mainstream as it is now. And so women, I think at that time, I don't remember hearing any women that were fighting. I dabbled in a bit of Muay Thai and boxing at the time, and it didn't really take me anywhere. And I would say it was about 2004 when I moved to Japan for a year. I went out there. I was a blue belt in jiu-jitsu, and in Japan, you have a long history of all sorts of martial arts also being taught in the schools. So I think to some degree, people are more comfortable with the idea of fighting, and females and males. So there was some pro MMA happening in Japan at the time, and that's where I got my first dose of it. And I jumped in and I did an amateur and a pro fight. I certainly didn't start fighting to fight MMA. I think I fell into jiu-jitsu wanting a different type of physical activity, probably sticking with it and being drawn in by the camaraderie and just the fascination with what jiu-jitsu is. I mean, it's a live puzzle that's changing all the time. So I fell in love with that, and then it expressed itself through the various avenues for competition. And I competed wherever I could, and I took every opportunity I had. I kind of try to do almost anything once. And when the opportunities would present themselves, I would jump on board. And that soon then became a bit of a habit and a passion of mine to continue fighting. And I'm not sure that I can honestly say it was always because I wanted to be the best. I think at the time, I don't know if you could say there was the best because there were just so few. Maybe it was more so I was doing it to see, what else was out there and how the other women were faring. And then it turned into something, I suppose, a little bit more competitive down the line.
Yeah, I when I think of jiu-jitsu in the post-jiu-jitsu competitive world, where again jiu-jitsu's become a thing, I think of jiu-jitsu a lot as what you spoke about. Like you were either learning it for a self-defense mechanism or you were learning it for an MMA purpose. And like I think of gyms in that time, and the majority of people that I spoke to that started training pre-2005-ish in the early 2000s, 1990s, it was a lot more of a violent atmosphere in an MMA gym. Like there was definitely strikes involved, and jiu-jitsu was definitely not just an art to learn to compete in jiu-jitsu. It was an art to learn how to defend yourself. Did that affect you in any way particular to a female that you would feel was a little more difficult for you?
I mean, I've said before that I think a lot of women from my time are all a little crazy for sticking with it as long as.
But in your defense, so are the dudes. Like everyone that got involved in MMA and jiu-jitsu at that time was probably from some other martial art. They would walk in the door to be like, "Hey, what's this jiu-jitsu stuff? I did karate for years." And before you know it, you start fighting, and then you start doing jiu-jitsu. That's the way I envisioned it. Anyway.
I mean, it was a much harder climate. I would say that the way I run my school today, the way that a lot of people probably run their businesses, would have thought that, if I knew then what I know now, like what we did was psychotic. Right. But I will add that I think the layer that makes it a little bit even murkier for females or tougher for females from that time is that, now you have a lot more females that are vocalizing unfair treatment or, being treated as a sexual object or, predatory sexual behavior. if you started when I started, that was just par for the course. Like, it was just there.
It was a boys club. It was what it was.
Club.
Right.
You were either going to be a boy in the boys club. And so, and I've definitely been in a number of environments where I was, and in my way of interpreting that was that it was a notch up, like I wasn't perceived as a threat by the guys. I was perceived as one of the dudes, and I was allowed to train with them and be part of their crew and be in on all the jokes. And whereas in some females today might draw the line and say, oh, like that's sort of in bad taste, or why would you do that in front of me? At the time, and I would still say in some circles today that a female being included as one of the dudes in that boys club is a good thing, because to some degree it means that you assimilated yourself enough that you're one of everybody else. So that was probably a very common dynamic that occurred. And as one of the people that saw everything that happened behind the scenes, when the black belt instructor shows up for the seminar from Brazil or wherever he comes from, and he starts picking on this blue belt female or that white belt female and taking them to the back of the garage to do their dirty do, you saw all of that. And I think at the time you didn't say much, because you just you kind of were like, oh wow, like this kind of stuff happens, and what are you supposed to do? Because you're trying to move up the ranks, you're trying to be part of a community, and yet you see things happening sometimes willingly, right? And you kind of have to decide, well, do I say something and make a scenario out of this, or do I turn a blind eye? So there were a lot of sketchy, maybe not so okay things that were happening back then that certainly are not appropriate or not sort of advocated for now. And so we've come a really long way in terms of what it's like to be a female in that type of a scenario. But I say to a lot of people, I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for all the good men that took me under their wing and treated me very well and helped me learn what I had to learn to get by, because it was rough, and if you didn't find sort of your pack and your way to survive, you were probably left out, or you didn't have the opportunity to learn. People also forget that maybe pre-2010 or so, the internet and learning jujitsu online or through books or DVDs or apps was a really bad thing. Like, you had to learn your jujitsu from the source. And so, so much has changed, and as tribal as it may have been back then, you had to learn how to navigate through that safely and intelligently, I think, in order to make any headway, and I think the women that are, in my position today, where we're, third, fourth degree black belts who've been in it for that long, I think they've seen a lot of things.
Yeah. I can imagine that every woman that has reached the level of jiu-jitsu that you're at, has been training for 15, 20 years plus, has had to endure that and kind of bit down on their lip and dealt with it, just because their love of jiu-jitsu was more than the outside influences of negativity. So I commend you for that, first of all, but I also commend you for the ability to be able to say, hey, look, and this is something that I appreciate you as someone that has been around the game for a long time, has now made a claim for yourself as a jiu-jitsu practitioner to speak up for those rights, to say that, no, things like that aren't appropriate. It's not appropriate for your head instructor to have sex, to prey upon every student in the gym, regardless of whether or not the females are willing, because the word willing you used, you can willing in quotation marks, like it's willing, yes, but you wield some bit of authority over those women because you have something that's desirable to them in terms of your jiu-jitsu. You know what I'm talking about? There's that level of infatuation that instructors 100% manipulate, and it was just part of the deal for so long. And then I'm glad that things have changed and things are coming around.
Yeah, I mean, Kevin, some things have changed and some things haven't, right? I think there are everything that I've said and a lot of things that I've seen and sometimes stood by and not made a fuss about at the time was done in a way because you know, sometimes in power dynamics you recognize that when you don't have any power to begin with, to try and speak up for the right thing or to do the right thing falls on deaf ears and in many ways completely cuts you out or ostracizes you from the group and you can't make an impression at all. And sometimes when you're in those types of scenarios and you're subjected to seeing or being treated a certain way, for me, it's about making a record of what goes on and not forgetting and waiting until the right moment where what I have to say can make an influence or does matter. And, you know, at the time, it was just so heavily dominated by men. And I would say, you know, really like rough around the edges type of groups of men sometimes, you know, where nobody would have given a crap if I contested anything that was going on or any of the females. And what I was saying about, you know, some things have changed, some things haven't. Male or female, I think everybody's been in a situation, whether it's in their school or in another academy or dojo, where there is definitely a jockeying for position amongst who gets closest to the, you know, center of the onion, to the head instructor or, you know, the cool kids in class. Everybody wants to be part of that crew. You know, usually the higher level belts or the ones that compete a lot, there's always some sort of social sway. And for dudes, it might translate to who can collect the most taps on the mat. For females, some of that is involved, but there are a lot of females along the way who also like overtly use their sexuality to find an in, right? So male or female, everybody's kind of guilty of using whatever influence they have to get the social sway and the power, if you will, so that they are in a better position than everybody else.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote an article about that for when De La Riva had his hiccups and all the things went down with that. We spoke about it on the on the podcast, and you know, one of the overall encompassing problems of that, and I get the idea that yes, it does go both ways. You know, believe me, I'm not naive enough to believe that women don't, you know, go after, you know, higher ranking belts simply for what you said there, to be a part of the club, to get in there, and they use their sexuality to be able to work that habit. But in my opinion, it always falls upon the head instructor to realize that. You have to understand, hey man, like, I appreciate this, you know, but jiu-jitsu is more important to me than this cheap thrill of taking advantage of some girl that's giving me attention and trying to get into my good graces in order to become a part of the clique. And, you know, the more and more the instructors start to take that on and start to realize that, the more the sport's going to grow and the better things start to come for everybody. It's unfortunate. You know, it's something you can't deal with. It happens. We have a situation where you have men and women in intimate situations that roll on the mat. You know, sometimes you're going to have sexual desires. It's just going to happen. It's just what happens. You know,
it happens. And I also said before that, you know, we're taking jiu-jitsu is kind of a funny thing where you usually, not always, but I think in a number of scenarios, men and women who have worked very hard and may have exceptional talent to some degree, but they're athletes, right? They're athletes first and foremost, who then, if they decide to build a business off of their passions, then become leaders. Maybe not by choice, right? Like doing jiu-jitsu yourself and loving it is not necessarily centered around leadership. But then you find someone who's really not that focused on being a leader, who has probably indulged in their own interests for most of their life, who now is responsible for leading random people that want to learn from them. And weird things happen.
Yeah, I agree with you in that accord 100%. Like, you know, I'm reading Robert Drysdale's book on the documentary he's writing right now as we speak. Closed God, he just sent me a copy of it. And the more and more I'm reading up on the history of jiu-jitsu and the beginning stages of jiu-jitsu, I'm starting to realize that some of the characters that were in the formative years of jiu-jitsu weren't necessarily the best people in terms. So, you know, just to use that as an analogy, when you talk about through the course of history, instructors do things and then their students follow the lead and think that that is the appropriate way to manage, appropriate way to act. And now when you're the instructor, you get to do whatever the hell you want to do. And that ethos continues on down the line. It's something that, you can call it cultural, you can call it whatever you want. It's something that we still see in modern MMA gyms. That's, kind of discouraging to me sometimes. I think that it still happens.
Yeah. I mean, look, it's human nature, right? And it's funny when you look at jiu-jitsu and the reasons why most of us begin practicing jiu-jitsu. And then the closer you get to it, the more involved you are. Sometimes you start to you can't unsee the things that you've seen, right? And then you go, oh, what am I doing this for? And who am I associated with?
Right. And then you get to a point where you're about halfway through your brown belt where you start to see the man behind the curtain and you're like, oh, why was I ever enamored with this person? He's good at jiu-jitsu and that's cool, but now that I know jiu-jitsu, like what in the hell was I ever thinking about this person as a role model for? But yeah, that's just the way it goes. So let's get back to you a little bit. That was a good conversation. I'm glad to hear your point of view on that. And it's something that I strive for in myself. It's something that I look to people like yourself for as beacons to help me do the right thing. But let's talk a little bit about you. Let's talk about you in jiu-jitsu. When did you start training with Marcelo Garcia?
So I started there, I would say like the tail end of 2009. It was funny. I ran into his wife Tatiana multiple times. I count them 3 times. 2 times on an airplane, once at a trade show. And my husband Jerry will even today chastise me because I was never really a fan of the sport. I was always just a practitioner, right? So I trained hard. I put my nose down. I liked to, I like to train as much as I can. And I didn't really pay that much attention to who was competing and making their mark. And I guess maybe to be fair, at the time, the social media and the internet was not what it is today. So it wasn't, like we had Gracie magazine in the print, and I years ago, but
to the young ones out there was a thing called a magazine at one time. You actually had to open up the pages and read things off of paper. It was, I know it's amazing. The prehistoric, but they were there.
And you signed up for a subscription.
Exactly. They'd mail it to your house.
And, I remember years ago working with Gracie magazine, and I would go to, the Pan Ams or whatever, and Luca Italo would be there, and some of the athletes would come up. You'd have like Kira Gracie or Tarsis Humphreys, and they would want something, or they'd want to talk to Luca, or be coming by for an interview. And my husband would be standing there, and my husband's been the biggest jiu-jitsu fanboy, and he's just like, oh my God, like it's so-and-so. And I was like, huh, what? Like, I had no idea what was going on. So the first time that we met Tatiana and Marcelo, I believe we were flying to California, and we were at Newark Airport getting ready to board a United flight. And we're in the line queue to board the airplane. And someone taps me on the shoulder, and I turn around, and it's Tatiana. And for those who are listening today who are not familiar with Tatiana Garcia, she is an absolutely incredible woman and formidable beast and competitor herself back in the day. And at the time, I had been well told that Tatiana had made a huge mark on women's jiu-jitsu in Brazil, and in many ways had a very, very well-versed, jiu-jitsu competition record, even maybe more so than Marcelo at the time when they were purple belts. And so she tapped me on the shoulder and she said, hey, I've seen you in some competitions and you're really good. She goes, you should come to train with me. And I was like, oh, great. Yeah, thanks. I didn't really know who she was. And behind her was Marcelo. And he would smile and wave, because this was very early on. I think must have been 2006, 2007. So he didn't speak a lot of English at the time. And after we would get on the plane, my husband would be like, oh shit, you know who that was? And I was like, who's that? And he's like, that was Marcelo Garcia. And I was like, I don't know who that is. And he's like, his wife just asked you to train. You better go train with her. So this happened a number of times. But my team at the time was a team that really was not about cross training, even, as a female and not having a lot of training partners. So I was made to feel in many ways that if I cross trained, I would be blacklisted and chastised. So I didn't take the opportunity the first few times. And even though I really wanted to. And the other thing I think that's difficult that maybe, your male listeners can't relate to, but females probably can, is it's very hard to find a female who's at your level, around your size, that's willing to train with you, not against you. Very difficult, even today. And so Tatiana had extended the offer, and it was, I would say, late 2009, I had a falling out with the team that I was with, and I finally took her up on her offer. And I went down to their school, and they had just reopened again in New York. And this was when Marcelo, believe it or not, had less than 100 students in New York City. And every class you trained with the man himself. And it was a really phenomenal, magical time. I really loved the time that I got to spend there, because I had never been in a gym where the love of jiu-jitsu was so pure, and where I didn't feel that there was a dynamic of trying to make a dollar or, lording power over your head, but somebody who just really, really just loved jiu-jitsu. And Tatiana was the best training partner for me. And she, as a friend, was able to help guide me and reshape my game and help me have a little bit more competitive success before I took a break. So it was an amazing time that I got to start training with Marcelo, and it started a relationship that's now 11 years old. So I'm forever grateful for that.
That's awesome. So you didn't really even go to train with Marcelo. It was more for going to train with Tatiana, so that you could find another female to help you along the way.
Yeah, I mean, no doubt there was immense respect for everything that Marcelo had accomplished. Absolutely. And you could say, people didn't go anywhere for women at the time.
Right.
Like we didn't train. I don't even know if there was a female teacher at the time. Maybe Lecca in California. But as a female, you wanted to find other females that shared the love as much as you did. And I'd heard so much about Tatiana, and to know that she was connected to Marcelo and they had invited me to their school, I was like, I'd love to take up the opportunity. So it was wonderful to know that I could learn from one of the best in the world at the time, or still, but at the time he was still climbing the ladder, and to have the guidance of his wife. And I would say, being able to be part of that school, and watch how they work together and see how she also helps support him to a lot of his championships. I mean, that is a really strong and wonderful woman that stands behind not only her man, but behind the students and the people in her school. So yeah, I went there for Tatiana to have something that I'd really never had before, and it changed my life for sure.
So you talked a little bit about the idea of cross training being a big no-no, and that's something that I've never been able to really wrap my head around. I kind of get the idea of it, back in the days of feudal, and I say that in right. I say that not in regards to the ancient kind of martial arts idea and ethos and old schools in Brazil, where there wasn't that many jiu-jitsu schools, where our jiu-jitsu here would be different than the jiu-jitsu down the street, and we were competing with one another. So you don't go train with them because you're going to give away trade secrets. But the sport has grown to a point to where now I don't understand how that could even be a question that you're going to learn to give away things that quickly. What do you think about that idea and ideology, and where do you stand with that? Particularly, so talk about it in the time when you switched, and then now in the present time.
I didn't understand it myself at the time, because I will say that the one caveat being a female was also that, because I was sort of rare, right? Like, to have a blue or a ranked female who loved jiu-jitsu, that wanted to train. In some ways, I was allowed to bend the rules a little bit and train at other places more so than maybe a man would, right? And so it was just, oh wow, like a woman showed up that's higher ranked. This is great. And a lot of people, when you would go train, would want to do everything they could to keep you in their gym because they saw you as potentially a profit bearing solution to, hey, we could grow a whole new demographic of student here. But it, you know, I never encountered lockdown so hard as I did when I started training with this team. And I recall working for them during this time where, you know, our smartphones didn't have, Facebook was not a thing. I think this was pre-Facebook. So people couldn't really organize themselves outside of hand-to-hand contact or, you know, physical contact. And they had a really big thing about students not training at other places and also not training even in their own home. So there was an episode, I thought it was absolutely bizarre, but there was an episode where they went on a witch hunt and tried to track down a small group of students that were apparently training in somebody's basement. And the head instructor made an entire scenario and joke around basement training and how crazy and illogical and nonsensical and radical this idea was, how any student could possibly think that they were capable of training on their own with other students in their basement. And these were like blue belt, purple belts at the time that they were persecuting. And they went on a witch hunt and they found 4 people and they kicked them out and they made an example of them.
It's crazy.
And I remember thinking at the time, this is very fucking weird. Like, why is this a problem? But, you know, usually when I've seen this type of scenario erupt, it is definitely around a sense of insecurity, a lack of confidence, you know, whether or not those people would admit it, but they feel that they have a lot to lose. And so when you're dealing with people with a very scarce mindset, they feel like there's not enough to go around, whether it's what I have shouldn't be shared with anybody other than the people who I sacredly choose to share it with. And everything is tight and everything is small, and it's a mentality that makes you feel like your world is smaller. It cuts down opportunities. It prevents you from growing versus, you know, today, in some ways, those borders have been broken down, maybe not by choice, but by technology. And now when you have social media and you have ways for people to organize themselves as they like, or you have websites that now invite open memberships, everybody's trade secrets are being thrown out there, and it's a matter of abundance. Hey, I don't need to just teach these 200 captive students, but if I throw up a website, I can now teach 2,000 or 20,000 people. And is it about learning? Maybe. Is it about making money and surviving and making a living in this sport? Maybe it's both. But now sharing is seen as a good thing, right? And so I think some students could probably get, especially during this pandemic, there's probably a lot of people getting away with learning on their own because they don't have their physical teacher. They don't have someone that they can actually go learn from. And, you know, as a ranked instructor, to some degree, you ask yourself, well, what am I responsible for? And what do students really need me for? All the information is readily available wherever they like it, you know, and it's really, the model has completely flipped on its head. So I feel like if you're not teaching in a school setting to build culture and to build leadership and to build camaraderie, your students can just go, if they just want to learn jujitsu, they can just go on the internet and cut you right out of the picture. Whereas in 10, 20 years ago, you couldn't do that.
Yeah, you know, when I think about that, when I think about the idea of, you know, cutting people off and controlling where they're training, so you can't go cross train, things like that, you can't train at your house alone. I think about the same concepts as I think about as professors that take advantage of the student professor dynamic and go after their female students or allow that transgressions to happen, those transgressions to happen. And I think of it as, you know, the idea that professors that run their own academy, they start to believe they have this godlike quality. They start to believe that they need to have complete control over every situation, and what they say is final. And like, I just think it just goes against everything that jujitsu is about to me. I think of jujitsu as different than other martial arts in that regard. That like, jujitsu is bigger than me. I'm an instructor. I'm a black belt, yeah, but like I'm not godlike. My words aren't the Bible. Like I do jujitsu, you do jujitsu. I might be better than you on the mat, and that could be the proving ground. But at the end of the day, like you can do what the hell you want to do.
But it's funny. I agree with you, but I think that the very nature of jujitsu and fighting, and the act of humbling oneself, the act of matching up against something that you don't know, reduces or helps you manage your ego, right? Because every day you go out there and you fight, and you get your ass handed to you, or you hand somebody else their ass. There's checks and balances, right? And you begin to sort of understand, okay, this works, that doesn't work. I have to refine this process. I have to learn something new. But I think what happens with a lot of instructors to a certain degree is they get into they build a glass castle around themselves. And the higher the rank you are and the higher up you go, and I'm going to even say, because I'm there, the older you get, the more injured you are, right? Like you get into a place where some people don't want to be challenged anymore because they don't want to it hurts. Maybe it hurts their body. It hurts their ego. Whatever it is, they stop exposing themselves to that fight, that practice of humbling the self every match, every day. And as you stop physically exposing yourself to that practice, it's very easy to begin to manufacture and drink your own Kool-Aid. And as that continues to progress, you then get into a place where you don't want to be challenged at all. And those type of people put their stamp on a lot of things. And because of the people that they surround themselves with, and maybe, a bit of brainwashing and a little bit of loyalty, that gets pounded into them, you have these types of scenarios that break out where there's a ton of abuse of power. And I think it's power that goes unchecked. And that is to me the purpose of jujitsu, is we check ourselves all the time, but we can easily put ourselves into an echo chamber where we don't want to be compromised.
That's a good segue for me to ask you another question along those lines, because that's an interesting point. You talked about how guys get older, they can't train as much, they forget, they don't end up challenging themselves, and maybe they're not challenging their students in their regard of saying I could just go out there and murk some purple belt to keep them in line and things like that. Like, how do you deal with that as someone that's growing a little bit older? Because this is a question that I ask myself a lot, because I still feel pretty viable enough to be able to go out there. If there's some arrogant little brown belt that needs to kind of learn a lesson, like I can still teach them that lesson, but there's going to be a time when I can't.
Yeah.
How do you as a professor maintain the hierarchy of authority without getting to the point of having to go into those arrogant, egocentric areas?
Listen, that's a good question, and it's really hard. And I don't know that I know the right answer because I'm right there right now, but I am trying to navigate it and figure it out. And what I've done since we've opened up our school is, myself and my business partner, Art, I try to invest in the people that are coming up under us, right? So, we have a number of, purple belts and brown belts who show a lot of passion and a lot of expertise. And I've said before as well, I think it's impossible for a singular instructor to be an expert in every type of guard that's coming out, right? Like every week there's something new. So I don't put the pressure upon myself to have to go out and learn squid guard and butterfly guard and closed guard, and and I look at what's coming up underneath us, and I try to nurture where other people's interests are, and I try to feed their hunger, whether it be with resources or maybe giving them the ability to connect with friends of mine to go train in other gyms. But I want them to grow and to become really good at what they're interested in. And I feel like if they can see that I wholeheartedly trust them and want to nurture the best in them, that I hope that there's more of a free, willing loyalty, if you will, that goes the other way, which is, hey, this instructor, this individual helped me become the best version of myself. why would I ever betray or, compromise that relationship? And I try to not rule with that type of an energy where I'm trying to close off opportunity, but I will, maybe I'll question you at times to help you contemplate the decisions that you're making. But I think that I would try to open up as many opportunities as I could for those individuals coming up under us who will, if you try to fight it, they're going to overtake you one day anyways, because there's a couple things that aren't changing. We're all getting older. We're all getting a little bit more broken. We all have a different sense of responsibility to ourselves and the world. And, who am I kidding? I'm going to turn 40 next week. I have had 3 children come out of my body. I've been competing for 20 years. Who am I to think that I'm going to put a smashing on a really talented 185-pound male brown belt that really wants to gun for the podium at Pan Am's? That's stupid.
Right.
So for me, it's about trying to help them move forward and ultimately embracing and understanding that and accepting that I'm not going to be better than them. On the mats, there's going to come a point where they will surpass me skill wise. And where I hope to give back is that maybe I have more wisdom that I can share with them that will make them feel as if this is the right choice. Like, I should stay with this lineage. I do want to support this system because this is what's helped me and what's going to help me help others. But I don't think it's not that common.
Do you, so you talked a lot about like not spending time, dedicating time to new techniques and things like that. So based upon that, do you believe that you can still, because your jiu-jitsu IQ is growing, that you can still think about these obscure techniques and understand them in conceptualized manners without the application of that? And do you feel like that'll be something that's going to grow as you continue to grow as a teacher?
Yeah. So it's not that I won't spend any time learning new techniques, but I sort of divide things up into sort of principles and concepts versus mechanics. And when I speak about mechanics, like let's say someone wants to teach me the mechanics of the Delahivu guard or some new, whatever, the squid guard, whatever is new at that time. If we were to examine our own process and our own games, I would imagine that your game probably breaks down into somewhat of a series of movements, high percentage movements that you can get on most people. And then as we get further down the chain of what some movements work with some people sometimes, and other movements you try and you're not successful. But there is a certain canon of things that you do that always works for Kevin, right? And there's a certain canon of things that I do that always works for me. How many times did you practice those movements in class and in training before you actually got it to work? I'm going to gather hundreds, if not thousands, of times and reps and years of practice, right? Like Marcelo Garcia's game did not become Marcelo Garcia's game in like 2 months or in 2-3 hour practices. It came that way from refining a number of movements. And so when I talk about not putting a ton of energy into learning all the new things that are coming out, like it would be impossible, I think, to take on every new type of guard that's coming out that everybody's on top of and saying, I'm going to learn this really competently, like really, really well. It takes years. I have too much respect for what people do to be able to say I can assume that in a short period of time. So when I say I don't invest that much time, it's just more so I can experiment with certain things. And then I'm really looking for the rules or like, what is the point here? Like what are we trying to do in this guard? What are we trying to do with this movement? And conceptually trying to wrap my head around how that technique works. And then there's certain things that I'm going to gravitate towards and I'm going to continue to work with them. And other things that I'm going to be like, you know what, I'll save that for another day. Because I think that as we get older in jiu-jitsu, it's almost like a lot of movements start to funnel down. And you really start to see that when you understand certain rules and principles, it kind of connects the rest of jiu-jitsu together. What I mean by that is, I recently had been speaking with somebody who was having difficulty executing movements from their guard. and they were really self-conscious about the fact that they couldn't execute much from their guard, and a lot of people kept passing their guard. And so when we dug into it a little bit more, I recognized that the person didn't know what they were doing in the guard. Like they didn't know what type of sweep or what type of submission or setup they were going for. So every time someone put them in guard, they were kind of just flailing and holding time for question mark, nothing. They didn't know where they were going with it. And this was a competent, this wasn't a white belt, right? So when we kind of started talking a little bit more about conceptually, well, where does the game go? Well, you should probably, I advise them, you should probably think about maybe 2 or 3 movements that you naturally find yourself going towards in terms of sweeping positions or submission positions. And you should be actively trying to go for those positions so that if you fall out of them, then you re-guard or you retain your guard to set back up for the attack. But without connecting those dots together, you just have mechanics. You just have all these little parts that don't really make sense. So I think as I get older in jiu-jitsu, spending more time thinking about how things are connecting together and the moments and the movements between is fascinating to me. And when I look and I speak with other instructors and high-level practitioners, it's some of these nuanced decisions that they make in the moment or the timing of something that make them so much more successful at what they do, not necessarily this guard or that position, because I think that can all be interchanged. And, really the secret sauce for me is, what are they doing? How are they timing things? What are they looking for so that this all effectively works together? Because I have children, I have small children, and I have a career outside of jiu-jitsu, and I don't have 30 hours a week to just spend studying all these different positions. But how do I keep myself interested, and how do I still be fascinated with what's coming out there? And for me, it's just, wow, like, look at all this stuff that we can study, and how does it all interconnect? How is it all related? That's where I go with it.
That's interesting. I as someone that is, a black belt now, it's been a black belt for 4 years. I'm starting to get to that. It's fun for me because, a lot, it's a cliche that everyone talks about when you get your black belt, your jiu-jitsu just starts for you, but it's kind of true. I think about the person and the grappler I was when I first got my black belt versus the grappler that I am 4 years into my black belt. And I think about how much more intuitive and how much more my understanding of the game and the strategies and the positional aspects of jiu-jitsu have all come so much farther in my teaching, and how much my love and appreciation for the art is. And I appreciate someone like yourself that's been training, long. You've been a black belt as long as I've been training. Like, I appreciate what you bring to the table. It's cool for me to think about being able to think on that level at one point.
Yeah, eventually I feel like we have to elevate our thinking around jiu-jitsu and technique. Sometimes when people come do private lessons with me, it's funny because I feel like some people show up expecting you to be able to teach them the magic move that's going to fix their whole game. And what I usually notice after moving with them a little while is, I say this to a lot of people, a lot of techniques, like, jiu-jitsu, but what you're missing is what you're doing between here and there. And if you don't understand the rules, if you don't understand what you're working for, then all these parts don't make sense. It's like having all the parts to a car, but not actually having the blueprint for where all the parts go and what they're supposed to do. And if that's the scenario, then you just have a bunch of parts, and who the fuck knows what it's supposed to do?
Yeah, that's awesome. It's funny. I think about a question that, like, if every belt rank asked me the same question, like, hey, tell me about guard retention. I'm having a problem. My guard gets getting past. Like, the conversations I have with the white belt, the blue belt, the purple belt, and the brown belt, and then the black belt are going to become less technique oriented and more philosophical oriented throughout the course of the ascension, the higher up the belt ranks you go. I just had a conversation with one of my brown belts the other day who's having problems with that same thing. And it was literally like the entire private lesson we took was just me, like, talking like some kind of, like, monk or something like that. And he's like, it's paid for this, but it's like, it's the truth. It's like, I can't teach you, everything, it. You just don't know that you know it yet. You don't understand how to make it work yet. And I can't teach you how to do that. I can kind of give you ideas, but you got to figure it out for yourself.
I feel a lot that, getting your black belt in some ways, like you said, it's just, I think that what we learn from white belt to black belt is just preparing us to really learn beyond black belt. Because by the time you get your black belt, hopefully you have learned the language of, I don't have to struggle to get my body to do X so that I can play with this, right? I don't have to figure out how to do this role. I already know. It gives you the physical language to put yourself into any scenario so that you can then play and contemplate and deconstruct all the cool shit that jiu-jitsu has to offer. Because the rest of that time leading up to that point, we are sitting there going, I don't know how to off balance my partner.
Yeah, right. I don't know what you're talking about. Where's the underhook go? Why I don't even the underhook. I don't even have to think about it. It's just there. I don't. I got an underhook. There it is. And it doesn't make sense.
I mean, the struggle is real at those levels because I remember teaching. It was a white belt or a blue belt a while back who had said, the main difference between having you do a movement to me or a higher belt versus someone my own level is that I notice that when I try to do something or someone my own level tries to do something, I feel them trying to do it with all the different parts. You guys know how to do everything all at the same time, and it just seems so easy. Yeah. And I think that's part of the beauty of it.
It's amazing to me just thinking about things because again, it's funny because every blue belt out there thinks you're some kind of a god that walks on water, but they forget like I was a blue belt too. There was a time when I didn't know what a grip was, and I struggled the same way you guys struggled. And when I look back at where I am now, I think about the amazing journey I've gone through and how things that are as complicated and insane to me as I thought they were when I was a purple belt are now. I don't even think about it. It just happens. And my understanding of that grows because I don't have to think about the technique. I can think about the when, the where, and the how, and some of the who I'm rolling with and differences in real time rather than focusing on the technique aspect of it.
Yeah.
So I got one last question for you because I think you definitely have a very unique perspective on this, and I'd like to get your ideas on this. So we always talk about the journey that a practitioner goes through, the idea of, everyone changes during jiu-jitsu. It's the thing that I find the most beautiful about the art when I teach it now. Like I enjoy teaching fighters, don't get me wrong. I enjoy teaching high-level competitors. It's fun for me. But what I truly, truly love and enjoy about jiu-jitsu is the changes it makes for people as they grow. I say this about jiu-jitsu all the time. It's one of the rare things in the world that will give you whatever you're missing. If you're strong, egocentric, it's going to humble you really quickly. If you're weak and meek, it's going to give you strength and hubris quickly, right? The question I want to ask you is this. As a female grappler, tell me some of the things that you may find differently that you could maybe give some female grapplers some advice to help them along that journey.
Oh, that's a good question. So in the consulting work that I do, I work in the peak performance realm. And, so much of that work is around how we develop the individual in the best way possible. How do we make the best version of Kevin? What do we have to deconstruct to figure out all the moving parts and then infuse Kevin with all the good stuff so that Kevin is the best version of Kevin, not Kevin trying to be the best version of what everybody else wants him to be, right? So what's your secret sauce? And I think, in the women's landscape, because there's so much growth, so much rapid growth happening now, so many different angles that you can take your image in jiu-jitsu. It's not just about jiu-jitsu, the sport anymore, but what do you look like when you do jiu-jitsu and how many followers do you have? And one of the things that I think jiu-jitsu has given me that I'm not sure that the female community is that aware of consciously is this idea of, when we train, when we fight, we know in any situation that becoming too invested in your emotions is usually some of your downfall, right? Because when your emotions and your conscious takes over your ability to fight, you sometimes don't think very clearly. And so I feel like as a practice, and I guess this is generically for both men and women, but a lot so for women, because I see women making a climb and I see women trying to make a really good impression in the jiu-jitsu community about what they're capable of doing is, to, I think, grow the women's sport, to grow the reputation and the strength and the community behind what we do. I think it's so important that we are able to engage in a practice and rise to the top based on how we express ourselves, how competently we're able to move on the mats, and not engage in sort of the heated emotions that we can get all caught up in. And I think that, there's so much that is coming at the women's community because it is growing, whether it's the sexual harassment or the way women want to portray themselves, or women wanting to have their own classes, or this or that. There's so many ways that we can break ourselves apart to make our case. But I feel like so much of our practice should be based on how do we keep ourselves in a state where we're constantly being checked, where we're constantly being humbled, where we're constantly moving forward, and not allowing all of these exterior things to distract us, to pull us away from expressing what competent and amazing practitioners we can really be. And I mean, I think that's really important, because the jiu-jitsu space is so much more complex today than it was 10 years ago. And I think for all of us, as we move forward, it's very difficult for us to practice the things that we can't see, right? Like, I can't tell you, hey, Kevin, you're way too hot. Like, you got to learn how to work on your patience. Go figure that out. Person to person, without jiu-jitsu in the picture, you're like, how do I do that? Should I go meditate? Should I go on a walk? Should I go breathe? Jiu-jitsu gives us a really interesting format where we can take all these intangible things in our lives and we can give ourselves purpose in our training and say, hey, I'm going to go learn, I'm going to go work on my patience, like whether it means I don't go for the sub as quickly as I normally would, whether it means I wait to set the movement up and get the person to play into my game a little bit more. You now have the ability to train this intangible thing in your training. And I think, for me, this idea of training your emotions and like learning how to manage yourself, grow the context of what you know so that you're not getting heated when you don't get what you want. Keep practicing, keep pushing yourself on all those boundaries so that you grow as a person and you're capable and you're able to handle way more than you would. And I think that would be something that I would, advise a lot of women to work on, is just think about how much more we are and how much more we are today than we were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and to keep growing that, and to really to believe in what you're learning, to believe in what you're practicing, and to not allow yourself to be distracted by your emotions, and not allow yourself to be distracted by everything else that's going on. We have a lot of work to do. We've done a lot of work, and I think that's the best way forward.
That was awesome. That was a good answer to a difficult question, and I appreciate that. So, with that, I think we're going to call it. I really appreciate your time, and this has been fun for me to have a conversation with you. It's not only are you far superior in your jiu-jitsu knowledge than I am, you also give a very unique perspective as being a female. I know you hate to say that, and I know you hate that ideology, but I feel it's important that I express that, because you have very unique perspectives on the thing that I love, and I like to hear those things because it helps me get better, and hopefully not just me, it helps the world get better.
I appreciate that, and I think that the other thing that's important to acknowledge, whether you've thought about this or not, is when you give voice to someone like me, like when you give voice to a female or somebody that's not you, I know it's kind of a cliche term right now, but you kind of diversify the perspectives at the top. And I think that's super important to making jiu-jitsu more inclusive. anything more inclusive. But
Mhm.
when you just have the same, and there's nothing wrong with the same, like the same has taken us a long way. But that majority, when you just open the door a crack and you invite somebody else that's not like you in, and you just give them a bit of platform, it builds not only the community's awareness, but even your own. Because, rewinding to the beginning of the call, and you're like, guys, gals, I do the same thing at the end of my classes. I'll be like, hey guys, because that's what I've grown up with. And in some ways, I don't even make room for myself. Right. And so I think by diversifying the people that you're giving some platform to, you're making a big change, and you're maybe leaving an impression on people who are going to be coming up after you, which is how we grow. And so I think, I love it. I hate it, but I think it's great.
Yeah, I try my best, and part of this is my own narcissistic needs. Of course, I love the spotlight. I'm trying to make a name for myself and all those other things like that. But at the end of the day, I really believe that in whatever sphere of influence I have, small sphere of influence I have, I really truly want to help build the sport and help people like yourself get a voice and be able to get your point of view out there and help to change the discourse and change the discussion and to a better means.
Yeah,
And
there's a lot of people doing negative things with the power that they have. And if you're doing something to give voice to people that have less power, or you're amplifying voices that should be heard, that's a good thing, dude.
well, Emily, thank you very much. Today was a great show. Emily's a great person, really intelligent discourse, really smart, and really good information. And you're an awesome grappler. You won the damn moon dolls. Holy shit, we didn't get to talk about that. I forgot we didn't even get to that point.
13 years ago, my friend.
Yeah, still impressive. We'll have to have you back on again. So this is Kevin Gallagher signing off on the Aces Jiu-Jitsu Club podcast, blog series, interview series, blah, 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 whatever we're calling this thing. And I'd like to thank Miss Emily Kwok one more time. Emily, anything you want to punch out to? Anybody want to talk about before we shut off? Any sponsors or anything?
No, man, just I know that context wise for time, I know that this is it's a hard time for a lot of jiu-jitsu schools and people. So please show your instructors that you care, however you can. I think jiu-jitsu is not going to die, but some people's livelihoods are. So
Exactly.
however you can get out there and support the people that you care about that are actually making a living doing this stuff, please do. Now's the time to throw your support. That's all.
All right. We're going to end it there. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll see you again.